Oh, that's better. That's much better. Could I see the slides? There we go. All right, actually works. I have a fancy clicker. Let me get that going. So nice to be back here. Holy crap, in-person events. Isn't this nice? Let's see if we can actually continue this next year. I like the breathing exercise at the beginning. That was so awesome to relax, and now I want to take a nap. But instead, why don't I do this talk? So, yeah, the book was basically an excuse for me to write probably the only actual keynote that I'll ever give, because you should always sort of step back and view things from a distance for a keynote. It's not, some technical deep dive, which are awesome, but, keynote's a chance to sort of take a step up and look at things with a broader view. And fortunately, there's this massive book that I wrote that allows me to do that for this particular talk. So the book was, a 4-year project just to produce this presentation this morning. Was it worth it? I don't think you could answer that with a straight face and say yes, but I did enjoy the story. I enjoyed doing the research for the story. I really enjoyed writing the story, and I really hated editing it for the next 3.5 years. But we finally finished, and then the question is, what can we learn from that experience? I wrote the book because I thought it was an interesting story about how Android succeeded, about the people behind it, and the way that they worked and the way that they achieved this sort of surprising thing. And I also thought that it was worth taking a step back from that and saying, okay, Android did this. What can we learn about other projects that we all work on that maybe we could carry forward? So the talk is going to basically walk through some Android history and factors that I believe led to some of the success that we've been able to see, and then take another step forward from there and say, now, how do we apply that to other things? So let's see if this works. Yes. Why projects succeed. So the graph that underlies this, we'll see this a little bit later, but that green line over to the right is Android. Basically started at the bottom of the entire smartphone ecosystem, and then within a couple of years, it went in a different direction. Fortunately for us, that direction was up. So as I said, this is all based on this book that I wrote. Took about 4 years, almost to the day. It's very long, and it has very, very many footnotes. I hope you read them. I hope the book has sort of a casual tone that I managed to inject myself into the story, because I wanted to tell this in a casual and conversational way, but the footnotes take it even a step further. So you can think of the footnotes as sort of being me, and the rest of the book being sort of a filtered me. It is, sorry, this is not really a sales pitch. I'm not making any money on the book. I just want people to enjoy the story. I think it's an interesting story. So it is out there in ebook form on various stores. It is available in paperback only from Amazon, which tends to be tricky if you don't live in the US. So it's sort of hit or miss in the rest of the world, and you can't find it in bookstores, which is why I will be working with No Starch Press, who's a tech publisher, and they distribute through Penguin. And starting this spring, they should be able to make it more widely available in the rest of the world. I'm also working on an audiobook. I recorded the entire thing, which took a very long time, and then I processed the audio, which took even longer, and then I realized the recording was crap, and now I have to redo all of it. So that will begin when I get home. So sometime in the next few months, hopefully there will be an audiobook as well. First of all, let's talk about history. Back in 2003 is when things began for Android itself. There was a startup called Photo Farm, and it was started by Andy Rubin and Chris White, who had been colleagues at WebTV years before. Andy Rubin had since founded and then left the Danger startup. They produced the Danger Hip Top, or it came out as the T-Mobile Sidekick, sort of a not hugely successful phone, but sort of a cult favorite phone that allowed people to do things like actually get email and browse the web in a real way on a very nascent, very early on smartphone platform at that time. But he'd moved on from there, and then he got together with Chris White, and they said, you know what would be awesome is to make digital cameras better, because the technology for producing pictures was getting quite amazing. I mean, obviously the camera, lens technology, like all of that stuff had been nailed for decades, and that was only improving. But then they married that with digital technology, so you could get these high-res pictures on these memory cards, and you could start to combine these worlds in really good ways, except that the software on these cameras was crap. right? The ability for these cameras to actually talk to the network and to interface with your computer or with other devices was very poor and very hard to use. And the ability to actually navigate the user interfaces was pretty hard too. And I think everybody agrees that since then, these large digital cameras haven't gotten any better. And it's because they didn't actually succeed at this plan. They said, we want an open source platform to improve networking and UI and all the software interfaces for these amazing hardware devices. But they were the only ones that wanted this. In 2004, they shopped this around to venture capitalists, especially in Silicon Valley area, and they said, hey, this is our huge idea. We're going to make cameras better. And the VCs said, yawn. This is not interesting to us. Maybe they didn't understand, maybe they didn't care about camera technology, but also cameras were starting to be integrated into even feature phones at that time, so you didn't have to squint too hard to say, does this market just go away? Is it only going to be an enthusiast market, and therefore, why is it worth somebody investing hugely in this? So along come Rich Miner and Nick Sears, who were a couple of business people that Andy had worked with when he was at Danger. Nick Sears was the person at T-Mobile that worked with them to create the T-Mobile Sidekick device. And Rich Miner was an investor. He worked at a venture fund for Orange Telecom, and that company and that venture fund invested in Danger, so he was quite aware of Andy and his background. And both of them came to Andy and said, yeah, nobody wants a camera, but what about phones? And Andy said, I don't want to do phones. I did phones. I'm tired of phones. Let's not do phones. But he happened to bring it up at a meeting, at a venture capitalist meeting, and the ears in the room perked up, and he thought, okay, fine, I'll do a phone. So they got together. Rich and Nick came in and helped write a business plan and helped write this pitch deck and became the third and fourth founders in what was then renamed from PhotoFarm to Android, the startup. And in 2005, in winter and spring of 2005, they had this PowerPoint presentation that they then shopped around to venture capitalists, not so much in the Valley because all of those VCs had already said no to Android. So instead, they took it to the East Coast, which is 3,000 miles away, and so they would never know, right? So they took it around to VCs, and they said, okay, here's our story, here's what we have in mind. And the key slide in this, I think, 17-slide deck is this one. And there's a couple of things going on here to note. So first of all, if you look at the numbers here, it basically says, okay, this is last year's numbers. In 2004, there were about 4 times the number of phones shipped in the world as PCs. And everybody thought, well, PC is the computing platform, and then we have this, phone thing happening. But in point of fact, if you look at the numbers, huge number of phones that were greater than the number of PCs out there, that was an opportunity. Now, obviously, these phones were very limited. Most of those were feature phones. You couldn't do anything interesting. But if you look at this other piece of information on the bottom, it talks about the capabilities of this hardware. The phones at that time, or rather the processors that you could use in phones, were as capable as the PCs in 1998. Well, people were doing pretty amazing things with PCs in 1998, so maybe it was possible that there was an opportunity to provide more capable phones for a much bigger potential marketplace. And VCs kind of like that idea. Big is good, it turns out, if money is your goal. And so they had some amount of success. They got offers from 2 different venture capital firms that said, okay, we believe you enough to give you, some initial funding. So here's a contract, go back and think about that. And at the same time, they had ongoing meetings with Google. The Google founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, were very familiar with Danger. They were big fans of the Sidekick devices because, for one thing, they hosted the Google services like the Google homepage much better than other phones did at the time. They liked the fact that you could have this real web experience and the constant online persistent connection that allowed you to get Gmail and messages in much more real time than you could on most other devices in the world at that time. So they had meetings with them, and eventually Google said, well, we could help you, or we could just acquire you. And so meeting, they talk about this and come to terms on sort of money and plans and how Google could help them realize the vision. And then finally, in July of 2005, they went into Google. They became part of Google. So one of the things to realize about that acquisition, I saw some discussion very recently online, some comment on a thread or Twitter, or who knows. Doesn't matter. And someone said, well, Google bought Android and then they just shipped this phone. I'm like, no. What they bought was 8 people and an idea. right? The software that they bought at the time was basically 3,000 lines of JavaScript. It was a demo, right? They had a vision of what they wanted to do. We're going to have an open source platform. We're going to have these rich applications that talk to services on the back ends. And that was about it, right? And they had this piece of software that could sort of show the vision. If you look at the early demo, it doesn't look anything like Android does today, but it sort of connected some of the dots saying this is what smartphone applications could be like if you help fund our company. But that was it. There was an administrative assistant. There were the 4 founders that I mentioned. There were 3 engineers actually writing code. So when they got acquired, they basically pushed the reboot button, and they started writing the platform at that time. So Android, the platform, work really begins in July of 2005 when they ended up at Google. So then they started hiring people, because you're going to need probably a few more people to build this thing, and then they started building toward 1.0. So in the time period between July of 2005 and late 2008 is when all of the work happened for building the platform. And there were many, many pieces for that. First of all, you need the kernel. The kernel was the Linux kernel. They were fortunately able to sort of take this thing and just use it, but they had to add capabilities to it, things like wake locks that allow the phone to actually stay partially awake so that you can receive a phone call, or so that if the screen turns off, it doesn't hang up the phone when you're talking to your mother. So kind of important capabilities for mobile devices that weren't really part of the Linux kernel at that time. So they added some capabilities, but for the most part, they were able to just use the Linux kernel as is. But what they really needed to do was write all the drivers so that that kernel could talk to the sensors and the display and the SD card and all of the hardware that was actually going to be on these phones. On top of that, they needed the language. So initially, they had the demo written in JavaScript, and that was one of the languages being debated for the language that could be used by Android application developers. Some people were in favor of that. Actually, more people were in favor of C++. A lot of the people on that early team came from the embedded world, and it's important, especially in really constrained hardware devices like they had at that time, to have complete control over everything: memory allocation, deallocation, and performance, and therefore it really is a C and C++ solution that they needed. So a lot of people were pushing for that. But that's kind of a high bar for a lot of developers. If you haven't worked in the embedded world, if you're not familiar with those languages, if you haven't thought about how to allocate memory before, you're going to have problems, right? And so the other language that they toyed with was the Java programming language, which had been used on the earlier Danger devices. So there were people there that knew about how to implement a platform on a constrained device that could use that programming language. And there was a huge benefit to using it, which was a lot of people knew it. They either learned it in a university or they were using it on PC programming, server programming, middleware, frameworks, whatever. A lot of people knew Java, and that meant that if they used that language, they could lower the barrier of entry for new developers to this new platform to say, hey, it's kind of like that thing you're already doing, except new APIs and capabilities. So that was the decision. They went back and forth for a while. They even thought about doing all 3 languages, but at some point they realized, wait, we got like 12 people on the team. How are we going to do that? And so Andy Rubin eventually said, you know what, we need one choice, and it is going to be Java. So thou shalt go forward and implement that language. That meant that they needed a runtime, so they brought in a runtime engineer, Dan Bornstein, who figured out, what can we reuse, what should we write from scratch. They decided to provide their own bytecodes, the Dalvik executable, so therefore they needed their own runtime in order to interpret that. So they needed to write the Dalvik runtime. On top of that, then they needed the framework, sort of the operating system level that exposes all this stuff in APIs so you can take advantage of what's on the platform, the toolkit, the visual side of the framework. They needed the graphics so you could actually see what the result was for these applications so that they could put the pixels onto the screen. They needed media so you could handle audio and video capabilities. They had the system UI so you could have a home screen, you could launch your applications, you could navigate around the device. And then you had the applications written on top of that. So this was the Google applications. They figured, actually the initial plan was there will be applications from external developers, and those are going to be really important. But there were also important applications that people wanted from Google. Google was already providing these applications for various mobile platforms out there, and they basically needed an Android version of these. Things like Gmail and Contacts, Calendar, Maps was becoming the killer application at that time when 1.0 launched for mobile devices, so you could sort of get around in the world. And these were going to be really important, but the application teams at Google had zero interest in writing those applications for Android because A, they were really busy with all the other platforms that actually had users, and B, Android was new, right? The SDK was constantly in flux. They would have had to constantly rewrite these things. So all these applications were being written on this really small Android team, in addition to everything else going on. They also needed to provide services because Gmail's only really useful if it can actually talk to the server where the email comes in. And if somebody sends you an email, it's kind of nice to know that it arrived. So then they needed this persistent connection between the devices and the servers at the back end to get the information. So they needed to make all of that work for basically all of this stuff. They weren't just local applications. They were local applications talking to all the cloud infrastructure that they had for those apps. And then, of course, they needed to provide an application marketplace. Now, in hindsight, it seems like, well, this is obvious. If it's a smartphone, it has an application ecosystem and it has an application store. Sure, that is obvious today. At that time, not so much. There were application stores before that. In fact, there was one on the Danger device. But the application stores were really hit or miss. They were highly curated by carriers. They were kind of a pain for developers to deal with. It wasn't really sort of a general concept for smartphones. Instead, there were sort of niche solutions for specific situations in specific areas. It wasn't really something that was figured out. In fact, when the iPhone was first coming out, they had no app store and no intention to provide one. The original plan for the iPhone was to actually have all of the applications not just curated by Apple, but provided by Apple. That's how they were going to get that highly curated experience that they wanted on their consumer device. They said, we will write all these amazing applications, and then if you want to provide some capability, knock yourself out with a web app. And that was about it, right? But then developers, partly because this is where Android was going at that time, said, no, actually, we can do much more for your platform if you let us in. So then Apple eventually released an SDK, public APIs, that applications could use, and then introduced the App Store. And now they have that app ecosystem, and Android from the beginning was always going to provide Android market. Make it as easy as possible for someone sitting at home to write an application, upload it to a store, and have everybody across the world download that thing. And then finally, they needed an SDK for developers to then be able to build these applications. You need a way for them to edit the code, to build the app, to profile it, to debug it, documentation you can read, reference documentation, guides, samples, tutorials, all that stuff that, again, lower the barrier of entry because you want to convince developers to come write applications for this. Well, you need to make it as easy as possible for them to do that, or no one's going to come to your party. So in the middle of this long tread toward 1.0, 2007 hits. And in the beginning of 2007, Apple came out and said, hey, we have this idea. We're going to have this thing called iPhone. So they announce it in January. 6 months later, they launch it. And now it created this interesting dynamic in the industry where touchscreens had existed before. They'd been on various form factor devices for many years. And in fact, they were even on a smartphone platform that launched shortly before the iPhone. I think it was the LG Prada. So it wasn't a new concept, but the way that it was integrated into everything else going on that phone made all of the manufacturers look hard at it and say, OK, well, that is now a checkbox item. If you're going to be a smartphone, then it needs to have a touchscreen. And all of these manufacturers that had been providing either feature phones or smartphones, of various descriptions in various weird contorted ways thought, well, we're not really a software company. We need something really quickly. How are we going to get there? And at the same time, Android said, well, we were going to provide touchscreen capability. That was always part of the plan, but that was going to be in device number 2. Device number 1 was going to be, let's get to market as quickly as possible. So they had a device they were working on called Sooner because they were going to deliver it sooner. And they worked really, really hard on names in the early days. And they said, OK, this device is basically a really good competitor to the BlackBerry. But in the world where touchscreens were required, that was not going to work very well. So they killed that device, and they pivoted basically immediately and said, OK, now what was going to be the second device, which they called the Dream, is now the first device. And that second device is going to have touchscreen capability. It's also going to have a hardware keyboard. and a D-pad and a trackpad, and like we're just gonna, I don't know if you've seen, you know, the Simpsons episodes where Homer gets to design a car. That's kind of what they were going for. We're just gonna put everything in there and we're gonna let the market figure out what they want. And then eventually the market figured out, yeah, touchscreens, that's probably the way to go. That's all we need. And then finally in October, so all of this stuff had happened before people even knew what Google was doing. There were rumors about a Google phone, and that's about all that people knew. But finally in October of that year in 2007, the first version of the SDK comes out that had a bunch of these APIs, including touchscreen support, right? So they've got it so that you can write an application using this stuff, and they have an emulator that can run it. But of course, there were no hardware devices yet. So you could actually write your application, you could run it in the built-in emulator that came with the SDK, but nobody outside the Android team had devices that you could run the stuff on yet. So now in October 2008, a year later, they finally get to 1.0. So they launch 1.0, they go ahead and release the first device, the T-Mobile G1, and they also open source everything. So they made good on the initial plan, which was kind of surprising at the time. Like, here's all this code that we spent many, many years writing, many, many dollars acquiring from some other companies in specific cases, and here it is for free. Because that was always the plan. This was going to be the differentiator for Android from these other approaches. You had Apple with their closed garden, nobody else could participate. You had Microsoft providing a platform, but it was a black box. You couldn't see what was inside of it, so it made it hard to port, and also it cost you per handset some amount of money. And then Android comes out and says, how about free? Zero. Zero sounds like a good price, doesn't it? All right, so then 2009, then we get this interesting graph where you can see, again, green line at the right, not much going on. So the G1 launches at the end of 2008, and people said, that's interesting, but it's not necessarily the phone that took everybody's imagination. A few people bought it, and you know, sales sort of crept along kind of slowly until the end of 2009, which I'll get to. But the main thing is to look at everybody else on this graph. These were the other smartphone things happening in the world, and all of them, if you'll notice, are above that green line. The solid blue line is iPhone, so that sort of came out and then kind of had a solid trajectory, just sort of going up and to the right, in the right direction. And in the meantime, Android was not. It was pretty much solidly at the bottom. So review the timeline again, founded the company, acquired iPhone, Public SDK 1.0, and then at the end of 2009, the Droid launch, which was an interesting hockey stick moment because that was the first consumer device that really had success in the real world when things started to get much more better. They started to move up in a more interesting way. So now, mid-2010, one of the most important things in Android, at least in my life, that's about when I joined the team. So I came along in May, and I saw kind of that graph. Android had moved up a little bit because of the Droid, but we were in a solid third, fourth, fifth place. And it wasn't clear we were going to change from there. Everybody was really excited about the iPhone, and then Microsoft is in the market, and of course Microsoft, if they're ever in your market, then you should be wary of them. And it just kind of looked like, yep, we're down in the pack somewhere. This will be interesting to see what happens there. But that is essentially when the hockey stick started. So if you take a look at the graph now, so I joined about here, and then it just kept going, right? I'd like to attribute it to me. Sure, yeah, let's do that. So there's an interesting business dynamic. Hiroshi, when I talked to him, said the industry was basically working in the background. Like the G1 had come out, and it had convinced manufacturers this thing is real. So then people start looking at it. They download the platform, and they start playing with it on their devices. But that all takes a very long time. The Droid came out, started having a real amount of sales, and in the meantime, the manufacturers were, as you said, spooling up, right? There was a bunch of stuff happening in the background that nobody saw. And then during 2010 is when all of those devices across the world started to come out. And that's when, basically, by 2011, nobody was talking about this graph anymore, right? So all these other platforms were still there, and the iPhone continued to do really, really well. Obviously, good device, solid manufacturer, good stuff. And in the meantime, nobody talked about those numbers anymore because Android just kind of took off and kept going. So now, as of last May, we've got, 3 billion devices, give or take a zero, running Android, right? So then the question that had me think about the book some many years ago was, how did all of this happen, right? Especially at that time, success was a lot like not preordained. This was not obvious that it was actually going to work. And you look at it in hindsight, and I think anybody looking at it now, like if you're new to this space, you may think, well, you know, Google has a lot of money and therefore they shipped this platform and therefore it worked. Not at all the case, right? How many of us have worked for successful companies that have had very unsuccessful projects? Many times, right? Like it's not obvious that any of this stuff works at any given time. So what was it that contributed to Android's success? So some of the factors that made it difficult for Android at that time, it was that tiny company of just 8 people, right? 3 engineers to begin with, then they hired 1 more during the summer, and then 1 joined about September, and then they had maybe 15 people on the team at the end of 2005, all running really fast to build this thing with all of those pieces that I went over there, right? So tiny team that had to build itself up from 0. All of those incredibly successful companies were in the market already, and they were doing very fine. Thank you very much. Nokia had like 70% market share across the world. They certainly owned all of the feature phones in the world, and they had some smartphone offerings. RIM was there, incredibly loyal user base. I remember that when I joined, I had people in the enterprise, friends in the enterprise space, who said, what are you doing with Android? Like, why don't you make that better? I'm going to stick with my BlackBerry because it's such an awesome device, right? They had that totally locked in. And Microsoft was there. A colleague said years ago, if Microsoft is in your market, get out. They're really good at shipping software, right? Even if they're not good at this version, they're going to be good at the next one or the one after that. If they want something, they will just keep plowing money and resources and people and ideas into it until it actually works. I'm going to trip on that. I'm absolutely going to trip. And so all of these companies were already there. Like, why was there any room for someone new? And then on top of that, in 2007, now the iPhone comes out, just confusing things further. Like, not only did you have competition from everybody that was already established in there for many years, but now you have a new entry into a market. And they may be new, but you know what? Apple's really good at shipping consumer devices, right? They know what they're doing there. So now the market just got more difficult. And yet, looking at another graph, so this is comparing the Android growth until 2014 with feature phones. So feature phones at the time, like that is what most people bought. Like, yeah, you could do a smartphone if you had a lot of money to buy the device and to pay this high monthly fee for data. But otherwise, you just get the phone that gives you the phone call and the messaging that you're looking for, and that's really all you needed in your life, and then you didn't have this huge monthly fee. But by 2014, as a combination of the capabilities of smartphones that convinced people like, no, actually, I need one of these devices instead, as well as the proliferation of devices and form factors and different kinds of these devices across the world, made the dynamics much more interesting. And people said, actually, instead of this cheaper feature phone thing, maybe I can pay a little bit more, and maybe it's not as much as it used to be to provide me with a smartphone instead. So Android started to become the de facto choice for phones overall, even compared to feature phone adoption. So if I look at all the stuff through all the interviews and the research that I did and being on the team for many years, the things that I believe boil down to the success for Android sort of come in 3 different buckets. One is the team itself, the people that were actually working on this thing. Another was the decisions they took early on as well as during the project that I believe led to some of that success. And the last one, a little bit harder to predict, but undeniable, is the timing of all of this stuff. So let's look at these. One of the most interesting things to me in doing the project was realizing how many of these people had actually worked together before. Right? So if we look at this graph, halfway through 2006, the majority of the Android team had actually worked together before at a small combination of companies, including others that I don't list here, like some people had been at Apple years ago, some people were at General Magic, but in particular, there were sort of 3 companies or factions where people had worked together. One was Danger. So Andy founded this, but many of the people on the early team had worked together at Danger, including Ficus Kirkpatrick and Brian Swetland and a few others. So they had all built a smartphone platform running the Java programming language and a runtime for that already. So they knew how to write a smartphone platform on a very constrained device, a much more constrained device, because that was like 5 years before Android even started, right? So this was something that they had skills in already. They'd done the kernel work, they'd done drivers, they'd done all this stuff for Danger already. And they'd also done the persistent connection. They had really good communications there. You could receive emails on the server. You would send it down there. They had a somewhat real browsing experience on this phone. So they came in with skills like primed and ready to go for this Android platform. Then you had the B platform. So how many people have heard of B Inc.? Right. Super interesting. It is like a cult classic operating system. It's a company that started in the early 90s with this stunning idea of, you know what, there's only 2 operating systems in the world. What about a third? Okay, so in America we have 2 political parties. We've got Democrats and Republicans, and occasionally someone will say, well, my stand doesn't match either of those, so I'm going to pick the third party. And that candidate is always the candidate that is going to lose by the widest margin, because we, at least in America, can't handle more than 2 concepts. That is it. I'm pretty sure this is why computers work really well. You've got binary, you've got 0, and you've got 1. And if there was a 2 as well, like, good luck. That's just not going to work, right? And it's the same in operating systems. People are like, well, I've got Mac and I've got Windows, and there's a what? Like, why do I, I have everything I need. But they came out with this thing, they worked really hard, there were a lot of interesting things about it. They did early on like multi-core, multi-processing stuff, multi-threaded UI programming, also multimedia stuff. Everything they did was multi. And so really interesting operating system for people to play with. And it turns out that a lot of the people that ended up at Android either did a lot of hobby projects on B, just like writing printer drivers for fun on the weekend, because that's what they did. Or they ended up at B itself, right? So they were working at B, and they developed all this experience building a developer platform, operating systems, kernels, drivers, all the stuff that you would need for any kind of operating system platform in the real world. It didn't happen to succeed at B, but it did happen to teach them everything that they would need to build that kind of system. So B couldn't sell their operating system, they couldn't sell their hardware, they pivoted and tried to do an internet appliance, which didn't sell to anybody. And then eventually they got acquired. In fact, they couldn't even sell the company. They didn't get acquired. Palm came in and said, okay, we won't buy you, B, but we'll buy all your people. Right? So they basically took half the development team, some of the intellectual property, and then cast off the rest. And then they proceeded, and Palm said, okay, we want these people, they know how to write operating systems. We want them to write an operating system for the mobile devices that we're going to develop. And then they ended up spinning out this company into what was called Palm Source. So then the team just kept developing, writing developer platforms, developing more skills, looking more at the mobile market and what could be done on constrained devices. And they ended up writing an operating system that was used on exactly 0 devices. Because by that time, Palm had decided, you know what, you can keep your OS. We're going to do our own thing over here. Because, I don't know, engineers like to do their own thing. And so they didn't end up having that used. But at the same time, they spent years and years developing the skills to do this. So eventually, in 2005, a bunch of those people, that company got acquired by another company called Access. They didn't really like where that company was going, and they ended up shifting over and moving on to Android. And then the third company that was a factor was Web TV. So a bunch of the people worked there on this TV internet technology. Seems weird, like I've been receiving TV through the internet for many, many years. So like I think we all think of those as the same thing. But back in the mid-90s, that was not a thing, right? You watched TV on the TV and you did internet on the PC. And they were usually in separate rooms and they didn't talk to each other at all. But Web TV said, well, maybe we could actually bring these things together. Microsoft said, seems like a pretty good idea. And so they bought that company and they did other TV, internet projects. And a bunch of those people, again, learned what it takes to build a developer platform with UI toolkit, applications on top of it. Different form factor, obviously, slightly bigger than a phone. But all the essentials that you would need to build a smartphone platform eventually. So they all come in with all of these skills. Not only that, but they also know each other, right? They've been working together in these different groups and subgroups for many, many years. So they jump-started the team with all of the kinds of experience that you would want on that early team. They also had an interesting dynamic on the team where the leadership for Android decided early on, we are going to run this like a startup. We're basically going to wall off Android from the rest of Google. Now, if anybody's been involved in an acquisition before or been at a company that's acquired companies, it tends to be very messy, and it tends to not work, frankly. And one of the problems is you will acquire a company, they'll come in, and there's a cultural mismatch, right? The way they did that in that startup isn't the way that the company works, or personalities don't mesh, or founders take off once they get their paycheck, or whatever it is. It's really hard to integrate a company. And so the leadership in Android said, okay, don't integrate us, just leave us on our own. Leadership dealt with Google, and paychecks came from Google. That was good. But everything else about Android was completely separate for many, many years, including when I was there, right? Everything we did was very separate. In fact, I still don't know how the rest of Google works, right? Because we have our own way of doing things, specifically in the Android department. We collaborate a lot more with the company than we used to. But we developed our own culture, our own way of doing things, our own tools and processes, because we were shipping a fundamentally different thing than the rest of Google was. They shipped web applications, they did infrastructure, networking stuff, they did server backend stuff, and essentially on Android, we didn't do any of that. We shipped devices. We shipped an operating system for devices and the stuff on top of that. And so we had different timelines, different constraints, different ways of doing things, different open source technologies that we needed to deal with. And so it was just easier for the team to focus on what they were doing separate from the rest of Google. This meant that it really gave them that feeling of working on their own project. Even though they're in a larger, well-funded company, they were really heads down working on the Android project, and they worked really, really hard at doing that. And this was not leadership saying, thou shalt work hard, I'd like to see you here at 2 a.m. It was everybody on the team getting really excited about what the vision was, knowing that they had a very small window of opportunity and running it as fast as they could to help everybody else on the team be able to achieve that. It was so important that there was this quote from Ficus where he was talking about how hard everybody worked. Actually, everybody talked about how hard everybody worked. I think they have kind of PTSD from those years. He said the currency of Android was working hard. Putting in a shitload of hours was very valuable culturally. He also said, I don't think of myself as this awesome engineer, but I will work as hard as I have to get the job done. And that was the attitude of the overall team at that time, was everybody just singularly focused on this is where we need to get to, and we will put in the effort in order to get there. So some of the key decisions that contributed to the success were certainly on the technology front. Like even when the G1 came out, it may not have attracted tons of users and tons of buyers, but there were really interesting aspects of the platform at that time that distinguished Android from whatever else was out there in the world at that time. Now, you may look at this now and go, well, this is just common on smartphones. Sure. But it wasn't at that time. These were actually distinguishing things about Android. There was the notification system, so you could easily find out what was going on in other applications throughout the device, even if you didn't happen to be using those apps at the time. And then you could use the notification panel to sort of easily navigate between these experiences. Multitasking was important from the beginning because the team realized that this wasn't the PC world. This wasn't the world where you're going to run inside an application, do everything you want related to that application there, but rather you're going to have these little tiny units of application, and you're going to want to go back and forth between different things. You're going to want to be in contacts to get the name and use that in Gmail and then pop out to a camera application to take a picture, to attach it, and you're just going to keep going back and forth. And so the ability for the platform at a very fundamental level to handle multitasking and to handle easy ways of getting back and forth in and out of these applications was really crucial. Security was built in at a very deep level from the beginning. This has only gotten more so in the years. We continue building in security because privacy and user privacy and data privacy continues to be more and more important, and so we keep building in more and more capabilities there. But in the beginning, they built it in down to the kernel level, where the Linux kernel has this idea of user IDs. And in the PC world that everybody knew at that time, that means I, as the user on my PC, would install this application, and that would have all of the rights that I did because it was my application. Makes sense, excuse me. I would install this other application. Again, that has all of my rights on the system because I installed it. But they realized on a phone that doesn't make sense. Like this application shouldn't have the rights to everything that I have, including things about other applications. Instead, we need to sandbox off all of the applications from each other. So they use the concept of user IDs on Linux at the application level. So when you run an application on Android, you're not running it as you. You are running it as that application. It is basically a virtual user on your device. And that automatically, down at that low fundamental layer, walls it off from everything else going on the system so that that application doesn't have access to the data of some other application on the device. And then finally, they built in this form factor flexibility in the very early days. There was a recognition that even though they were shipping the G1, and this is exactly what it's going to look like, and maybe the G2 was going to look very, very similar, but at some point, somebody's going to want to ship a device that has nothing to do with that form factor, and we need to build in those capabilities from the beginning. There was an interesting tension in the early days where the team was really good at making very pragmatic, quick decisions and moving in a single line because they had to get to 1.0 and ship that device. But at the same time, they were saying, but what are the platform capabilities that we need to expand into other markets and have other capabilities? And so they, even though the G1 may not need that form factor flexibility, they said, well, but there may be other screen sizes, there may be other densities that we need to handle eventually. And so they built in things like flexible layouts so that when these other form factors came out and ran the application that you wrote, assuming the G1 or the emulator screen, that it would actually look reasonable on these new devices. It was harder and it took more time for the platform to offer that, and it was harder for developers to build their applications with this in mind, but it was the right decision in the long term for the overall platform capabilities. Developer tools were critical from the beginning. Like they wanted to make sure that this was not just capabilities that they were building for the Google applications that they were going to ship, because they recognized that actually most of the applications people are going to use are hopefully going to be written by other people, not just Google. And so they needed to provide a language that was approachable for other developers, so they picked the Java programming language. They needed to provide public APIs, so Gmail was written to the public APIs of Android, not to some secret APIs that wouldn't be exposed for external developers. They needed to provide the SDK with all of those tools so you could actually build the application, reference the documentation that you needed to, have all the facilities so that you could actually provide these things. And then they needed to have the application store, Android Market at that time. They also had important business decisions along the way. The initial decision to be open source, that's how they were going to differentiate from the other offerings out there. Because one of the problems that at least some of the Palm source people saw at the time was you could provide the best operating system in the world, but some other company is not necessarily going to want it because they don't trust you. They do not trust where your company is going to go with that platform. Maybe they don't want to pay you a licensing fee, or maybe they just don't know that next year you're going to be shutting it down or whatever. And in the meantime, they put a lot of money and resources and time into their decisions. So they would not take on a Palm source thing because they just didn't know how to predict how this is going to go in the future. But if there's an open source platform, to some extent, that doesn't matter. They have access to all the code. They could just take that code and walk away. If somebody stops providing support for that open source platform, they still got the code, right? So this was a way to attract everybody that wasn't Google to the table because now it didn't really matter what Google's interests were because these companies could make independent decisions because it was all out there anyway. The Open Handset Alliance is really not a factor anymore. If you go to the website, it looks very 2012. But at the time, it was really important. It was a collection of competing companies coming together, manufacturers, handset carriers, service companies, chip manufacturers, all coming together and saying, we're standing with Google and Android. We think this is a good thing for the ecosystem. We're all going to support this thing, provide services and devices going forward. And it was sort of an important moment for the industry to say, hey, if all these people are coming together, maybe this is something that I need to pay attention to. Compatibility was hard in the beginning. So now, if you're shipping a device, it is clearly in your best interest to be compatible with the other Android devices out there because you want to make sure that the person that wrote their application 3 years ago for some other competing device will have an application that runs just fine on yours. You don't want them to run it on yours and realize, oh, we didn't implement this function over here and now it crashes, right? So everybody wants that compatibility now. In the early days, not so much, right? Android wasn't a thing yet. Maybe you didn't care whether your application, your devices ran the same applications as other devices out there. And so Google had to work really hard and convince these people like, no, this is why this works. This is why this is really important. Here's this CTS test suite you can run to verify that we're all going to run the same kind of bits because eventually it will matter. And it turns out, fortunately, they were right. And then finally, partnerships. If you look at what we did in the early days, the devices that we helped out with, whether it was the G1, the G2, so the Droid device, or the Nexus devices, starting with Passion or Nexus 1, we kept working with different manufacturers. We would go to HTC for one device, we'd work with Samsung on a different one, we'd work with LG on another one, and it was very intentional that we didn't want to just go in a particular straight line and then convince everybody else that Google was partnering with that company and they were out of the mix. Instead, we wanted everybody to feel a part of that ecosystem because we really do want it to be a platform that everybody can use for their own devices, whatever they happen to be. Right? So establishing those partnerships early on and working very intentionally with them was an important part of making them all feel like they had a vested interest in where Android was going. And then finally, the decision to be acquired. So maybe this is obvious, like, of course you want to be acquired with Google, but not necessarily if your intention, which was the case for the founders, was to ship that thing. Well, acquisition is a really good way to ensure that it not happen in a lot of cases, unfortunately. Like, maybe you make a bunch of money out of it, but things tend to fritter away once you get into the big bureaucratic organization. But they decided, especially if we're going to wall off this group here, the funding that Google has so that we can acquire the technology that we need to and hire the size team that we need to, the infrastructure that they have was really important. So when Android actually started to scale and those services were more important and we needed to connect to all these devices, that might have been a really difficult thing for a startup to be able to handle. But when you're working inside a company that handles the needs of something like YouTube, infrastructure maybe not as big a deal. And then finally, leverage with partners was important because as a startup, they might call up Texas Instruments and say, hey, we'd love to get one of those developer boards. And if they bother calling you back, they may also give you a price tag because they don't really want to waste their time with you. Whereas if you're working at a company like Google, they'll probably pick up the phone. In fact, they may even call Google and say, hey, we've got a developer board. Would you like to play with that? And then finally, you can't deny the factor of timing. In fact, I talked to most people when I did the interviews, and I would ask them, why do you think this thing worked? And everybody had their own take on it, but also most of them said exactly this. It was at the right place in the right time. Mobile hardware was, one of the timing aspects was the hardware was finally getting powerful enough for this. So CPUs, nascent GPUs, although they weren't certainly there by the G1, but the capabilities of the screens, all of the things that were contributing and sort of coming and converging at the same time to be able to build these devices that were now going to be powerful enough to support what they wanted to do. The hiring opportunities presented by those other companies so that all of those people coming from B and WebTV, Microsoft, and all of those places happen to be available at the right time so that they could sort of come in as groups and jumpstart this team very quickly. And finally, the iPhone. And this is a weird one. In hindsight, people may think, well, the iPhone competition must have just almost killed Android. And it's true. The iPhone competition is and always has been really, really stiff. They offer a good device. And obviously, that's something that you need to deal with when you're building your own stuff. But if your company name was not Apple, how does that help you? If you want to ship a phone in the world and you want to get in on the smartphone world marketplace and your name is not Apple, what are you going to do? They realized they didn't have a smartphone platform of their own, and it was going to take a lot of effort and maybe skills that they didn't even have to build something that was going to be competitive to the iPhone. And they didn't have that, and they were looking around for a solution, and Android happened to be there. They weren't ready yet, but they were going in the right direction, so that attracted companies to say, okay, now we're interested, let's talk. All right, so now we've got roughly 3 billion devices, which means we're done, right? No, I would say instead, at least we're still here. So Hiroshi Lockheimer is in charge of Android as well as Chrome and Chrome OS and a bunch of platform stuff. Said the competition, it never ends. It's relentless. Every day we're competing. It just never feels done. That's why I'm still here. And it's why all of us are still there. We don't feel like, hey, we've succeeded. We feel like we're still alive, which means that a lot of the decisions that were taken early on that may have resulted in rough APIs or trade-offs, now we at least have a chance to maybe fix some of those things going forward. If you look around, you'll see everybody running in the same race with you, and they're very, very close at all times. And so you just need to keep running. And so you can, I would say you could keep succeeding or you could keep being a part of the race. But it's not like, and then you're there and you can just give up. Because once you do that, then the tortoise passes the hare and the race is over. All right, so let's take that step back and finally get to the point of this entire talk, 50 minutes in, and say, why do projects succeed? What do we learn from all that Android stuff that we could maybe apply elsewhere? I would say one of the important things is to have a vision from the beginning and to stick to that vision. I've seen a lot of projects sort of change along the way, like, no, now we're this kind of company. No, now we're doing this over here. And then you never reach the original goal, which means you're not actually going to be anything at the end. Now, you need to react. If the market changes out from under you, you need to be able to react to that. But at least having an original, clear idea, like open source for Android is going to be the way forward. Or we're going to build both a product and a platform. This is important for Android. Yes, they were going to provide the G1, some sort of Google-branded or Google-assisted phone, but they were also providing a platform specifically so that everybody else in the world could provide devices as well. That was one of the original ideas, and they stuck to it with a lot of the engineering decisions that they made along the way to make sure that they could actually eventually realize that vision. The team has to have the right focus. For Android, that was enabled by the leadership saying, okay, we're going to be separated from Google. We're going to have the startup mentality. We're going to be inwardly focused because everybody knows what we're trying to do with this product. Regardless of all this web stuff that Google is working on, that doesn't affect us. We are shipping a platform and a device. And the ability for the team to actually stay focused on that was really critical at that time, not getting fractured into other priorities for other teams and other companies, but just singularly focused on what it was that the Android product area needed to do instead. Hiring the right people was really key, and I would say even if they're not the right people for the company, or even if the company doesn't think that they're the right people, at the time that Android was acquired, Google was really into pedigree. They really liked engineers that came from top engineering schools. And then they acquired this company where many of the people on the early team did not come from top engineering schools. Many of the people on the early team did not have college degrees. Ficus, who I had the quote up there earlier, he doesn't have a high school degree. Right? But they had exactly the right experience for what they were trying to build. They were going to build those embedded operating system, a developer platform with APIs, applications on top of it. It needed kernels, it needed drivers, all this stuff that was really not in the skill set of most people at Google, nor was it in the skill set of the people that would pass easily through Google interviews. And so they had to work around that system and say, okay, these are the kind of people we need to hire. We're going to ignore what Google is saying about that hiring process and focus on the people that are going to build the product that we actually need. The team did work incredibly hard, and I believe that was an important factor. It may not always be necessary. I certainly hope it's not necessary in everything that we do, but when there was a window of opportunity, they drove really, really hard at it, knowing that if they took too long, that window would close. Right? Not only was there a lot of competition then at the time, but there were other people trying to enter the market, people like Palm coming out with their WebOS stuff. Right? So if they had waited, if they had slipped another year, then they probably wouldn't exist. So the fact that the team could actually say, this is really important to us personally, not being driven by management, but by themselves, was an important factor in them being able to drive toward 1.0 and do things like pivot on a dime when they said, touchscreens are really important. Okay, we're going to work really hard at getting that support in and ship this other device instead. But it's also important to note that they did ease up eventually. They had to run really hard to get to 1.0, and then to keep putting in more fundamental capabilities into the platform to get to the place where they needed to actually compete on a real level. But then eventually, the team got big enough, and they slowed down the cadence. Now we have annual releases. We stopped coming in on Sundays. We stopped driving quite as hard, and now we have sort of a regular work schedule, which is also important. If you keep working really hard forever, that's called a death march. Right? You're not going to stay there. I'm not going to stay there. All of your employees are going to leave because there's a realization that I don't want to just work in my life. I need something eventually. So everybody can crunch for a little bit, but eventually you need to ease up and actually have a life outside of work as well. Competition ends up being good for two reasons. One is it fosters ideas and innovation. I believe that the stuff that is going on that other platform over there is really good, and it makes us think harder about the things that we can provide that will also be attractive to users and developers in the real world. So that's fantastic. I think that competition fosters innovation. But I also think that it fosters an interesting business dynamic. I think the obvious thing to say is that Android had a hard time getting out there because of iPhone. But in fact, iPhone enabled Android. Right? The fact that they were only one manufacturer meant that every other phone manufacturer in the world needed a solution. The fact that they went with one carrier in each market, AT&T in the US, meant that every other carrier in the world needed a solution. And that provided an opportunity for Android. So it's not obvious, but I think that competition actually enables things in ways that you may not expect. And also, it's important to just keep going. So if you look at the graph here, you see that, and the graph goes off to the left as well. It started, way back in 2005 when they got to Google with no visible results. They worked really, really hard, 3.5 years just to ship 1.0. And then they just kept going because 1.0 was not the solution that they needed yet. So they kept going, and then eventually the curve, all those devices had spooled up, and things got a little bit better, and the team could ease up just a little bit. But they realized what it was they needed to achieve, and so they just kept driving until they got there. And then finally, timing you cannot predict. You cannot affect timing, but you can be aware of it. You can be aware if the market is changing out from under you. You can be aware, in the case of iPhone coming out and touchscreens being necessary, that you need to pivot. You need to change things around and run as fast as you can to make sure that you can take advantage of that timing window that you see. I don't know where we're at. I think we're running late on the schedule. I don't know what that means. Do you mean stop now? What this slide means is that I can't take questions. I do want to point out that one of the most important things for the book is, and this for any other writers out there, is to make sure that there is somebody on your engineering team that is an amazing illustrator. So Dan Sandler leads the system UI team. He's in the book a little bit, but his drawings are all over the book, and they're fantastic. He's done the Easter eggs for a few releases, and he's done some of the Android logos. So I just want to have a shout out to Dan for his really fun art in the book. And then finally, because I didn't take any questions, I'll also add that there's one final factor that you cannot deny, which is luck. I love this, again, quote from Ficus, that anytime anything works out, if you don't acknowledge the huge luck factor, you're kind of a jerk, right? And there's two ways to look at this. If you have a really successful project, hey, kudos to you. I'm sure you worked really hard and you're an amazing person. It doesn't mean that it is all that is responsible for your success. Also, there's a bit of luck, whether it's timing in the marketplace, happening to find the right people, happening to have the right idea at the right time, whatever it is, you have to acknowledge that maybe luck has a little bit to do with it as well. But also, if you're on an unsuccessful project, which I have been on many, I think most of us have. I think most of the things that we work on aren't hugely successful because that is the way that reality works. But you have to acknowledge there that maybe it wasn't all your fault either. And that maybe what we can do at that point, all that we can do is then pick ourselves up and try again. And that is it. Thanks.